According to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, intellectual disability, or ID, is defined as significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning existing concurrently with deficits in adapted behavior and manifested during the developmental period that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Please watch the short video attached for a breakdown of this definition. With three main aspects to consider when being diagnosed, intellectual disability is determined by evaluating the age of a person, their scores on an intelligence test, and assessment of their adapted behaviors. Typically, difficulty with two or more adapted behaviors along with the results of an IQ test will result in the medical diagnosis of intellectual disability. There are varying levels of IQ in people with intellectual disability ranging from mild and moderate to severe and profound. Along with the multiple degrees of IQ, people with ID may have difficulty with adapted skills, including conceptual skills like reading, expressive language, social skills, including self-esteem and responsibility, and practical skills encompassing self-care, mobility, self-direction, and independent living. Depending on the range of IQ and the types of adaptive skills an individual with intellectual disability struggles with determines the severity of their disability. There are various characteristics and types of syndromes associated with intellectual disability. The most common syndromes are autism, Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Children with intellectual disability will display specific characteristics. These signs can be what generate concern in parents or adults in charge of a child expressing these traits but yet to be diagnosed. Any of these observed behaviors may prompt an evaluation of the child and lead to a diagnosis. A child with ID will sit up, crawl, or walk later than other children. He or she will learn to talk later or have trouble speaking. A child with ID will find it hard to remember things and not understand how to pay for things. He or she will have trouble understanding social rules, seeing the consequences of their actions, solving problems, and thinking logically. The current attitudes towards individuals with intellectual disability, the educational programs in place, and the services and laws concerning the needs and rights of people with ID have come about gradually. Through advances in the understanding of the disability, laws put in place, and a developing appreciation for the rights of all people. Let's take a look back at the historical events that have led up to the accommodations and opportunities in place today for people with intellectual disability. In 1876, the French physician Edward Seguin founded what would eventually become the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, or AAIDD. Still running today, the AAIDD is the oldest and largest organization concerned with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In the 19th century, French physicians Jean-Marc Gaspard Attard and Edouard Seguin developed curriculum for intellectually disabled people, focusing on sensory, self-care, and vocational skills. Aspects of this method are still used today. The development of intelligence testing by Theodore Simon and Alfred Binet in the late 20th century allowed for clinical definitions of intellectual disability. Scientific advances during this time also increased understanding of the causes and prevention of intellectual disability. In the 1950s, the National Association for Retarded Children, now referred to as the ARC, to avoid using the word retarded, established with the intent to advocate the service, the need, and rights of those children with intellectual disabilities. In October of 1961, President John F. Kennedy established the President's Panel on Mental Retardation, now the President's Committee on Intellectual Disabilities, establishing a national agenda for policy, research, prevention, education, and services. The Education for All Handicapped Children's Act of 1975 guaranteed children with disabilities the right to a free, appropriate public education. In 1994, the United Nations passed the Standard Rules of Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, providing international standards for programs, policies, and laws for those with disabilities. In October 2010, President Barack Obama signed Rosa's Law, deeming the term mental retardation unacceptable and replacing it with the term intellectual disability. However, the term intellectual disability still refers to the same population as did mental retardation. With these various advances and laws put in place over time, people today with intellectual disability have an overall better quality of life. Intellectual disability is the most common developmental disability. 1 to 3% of the population is diagnosed with it. More than 545,000 children ages 6 to 21 in the U.S. have some level of intellectual disability and receive special education services in a public school. 1 in every 10 children who need special education have some form of intellectual disability. The information below provides the most recent data from the 2009-2011 American Community Survey 3-year estimates of intellectual cognitive disability rates in Texas and the counties of interest. There are no definitive rates available for children under the age of 5. As you can see from the data collected in Texas, the numbers demonstrate 1 to 3% of the population as diagnosed with intellectual disability. There are various possible causes of intellectual disability. Genetic conditions are one source to blame. Abnormal genes can be inherited from parents. Errors can occur when genes combined or other reasons in the genetic condition can cause an intellectual disability in an individual. Problems that occur during pregnancy can cause an intellectual disability. If a baby does not develop inside the mother properly, ID could result. There may be a problem with the way the baby's cells divide as the baby grows. If a woman drinks alcohol or gets an infection like rubella during pregnancy, it may cause an intellectual disability. Problems can occur at birth. During labor and delivery, the baby may not get enough oxygen. Health problems can be the reason someone has an intellectual disability. Diseases like whooping cough, the measles, or meningitis can be the cause. Extreme malnutrition, not eating right, may be responsible. Not getting enough medical care could also be at fault. The exposure to poisons like lead or mercury can be responsible as well. The common link between all the factors is the lack of normal growth and development within the brain. Social reactions to people with intellectual disability have ranged from positive, such as producing caretaking responses, to rather negative, promoting rejection. Early histories of Western society viewed people with ID as possessed, leading to less concern for their treatment and welfare. In the 19th and 20th centuries, special hospitals and institutions were constructed to provide care and treatment for people who would now most likely be identified as having intellectual disabilities. As the 20th century began, there was concern for the treatment of individuals with intellectual disabilities, yet that concern was tempered with less than favorable attitudes about where or how the condition originated. The early 20th century was characterized by the rise of eugenics, born of social Darwinism, a belief that natural selection and principles of, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, could be applied to humans, and that people with intellectual disabilities should be segregated from society and sterilized to prevent reproduction. Even professionals in charge of the so-called, quote, feeble-minded, end quote, believed a variety of social problems including crime, pauperism, alcoholism, and prostitution were caused by this population of society. As the 20th century progressed, the ideas of eugenics lost favor over the concern for civil rights. Quote, normalization, end quote, providing as typical a life in home and community settings as possible, became the guiding standard in improving the services available for people with intellectual disabilities. The success of parents and families in particular in organizing an advocacy movement pushed the nation toward recognition of and legislation guaranteeing the needs and rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities. How students are identified. Many students with intellectual disabilities are not identified until school age. The major purpose of identifying individuals with intellectual disabilities is to provide them with appropriate education and services. Students are identified in 3 ways. Number 1, intelligence testing. General functioning can be measured by one or more individually administered and standardized tests of intelligence. Number 2, adaptive behavior skills assessment. This measures the student's ability to perform skills needed for everyday life. This could also include interviews of an adult familiar with the individual with suspected intellectual disability to rate the overall adapted skills of the student. This measures skills such as dressing, table manners, handling money, and telling time. Third, academic skills assessment. General achievement tests such as the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, or, when appropriate, specific academic areas such as reading or math can be evaluated. Diagnosis: IQ is approximately 70 to 75 or below. Individual displays significant limitations in adaptive skills. The age of onset is below 18 years. Today, most students with intellectual disabilities will spend part of their school day in general education classrooms, particularly in the early grades. When selecting materials and teaching strategies for students with intellectual disabilities, teachers must consider each individual's unique educational needs and keeping in mind the long-term goal for the student, independence. This is a crucial component of success. Before inclusive education movement, students with intellectual disabilities were taught in different instructional environments. The belief was that because the instructional needs of students with intellectual disabilities were so divergent from those without the disability, there was a need for their education to be distinctly different. Separate educational environments may not be necessary for most students with intellectual disabilities, especially those with mild intellectual disabilities. Instructional environment are key for student success. Physical arrangement of the classroom. Students should be included within the general education classroom, not seated on the side or a special table. Teachers may need to be flexible enough to change around the room from time to time. Elements of physical arrangement should be planned accordingly by the student's age: preschool, elementary, and secondary classrooms. I focused on looking at how a secondary classroom should be set up because I currently teach high school. Teachers should keep in mind the major goal of teaching students with intellectual disabilities at this age is to prepare them for life outside of the classroom. Teaching should involve attempting to make all instruction immediately relevant for out-of-school adjustment. Classrooms should be neat and uncluttered. Instructional grouping. One-to-one instruction is not the only possible method of teaching. With careful planning, instruction can happen even in small groups. The advantages of small group instruction are that peer models can be used and students can experience instruction in a less restrictive environment. Cooperative learning. Students with various abilities work together and are responsible for both their own learning as well as the group's reaching specific goals. Students need not have the same levels of nor do they need to be working on the same skill as long as they are working together towards a mutual goal. For example, if students are working on a report, one student with intellectual disabilities could be responsible for perhaps working on the illustrations, while another student without an intellectual disability could be working on another section of that report. There are guidelines for implementing cooperative learning within our classrooms. Place students with disabilities in groups who are willing and able to help. Ensure that group goals and individual accountability are clear. Provide students with specific training in interpersonal, social, and cooperative learning skills. Monitor group functioning. Resist the temptation to interrupt groups to help students with disabilities. Keep assignments similar in length for all students. Establish an ethic of cooperation in the class. Teachers may use peer tutoring in the instructional environment. For example, students with intellectual disabilities would work directly with their peers. Using a buddy system, students could go over instructions, explain rules, or answer questions. Whole group instruction is the most common. The demands can be very difficult for students with intellectual disabilities who have difficulty maintaining attention, especially in large classrooms with lots of students. Students with intellectual disabilities need to be taught self-regulation strategies for remaining attentive. Teachers could prepare outline notes. Teachers need to engage in the students on a high frequency and check for comprehension. Instructional technologies play a significant role in teaching students with intellectual disabilities. Assistive technology increases independence, productivity, self-esteem, self-reliance, and self-determination. There are two benefits. One, removing barriers in the classroom, and two, adapting the curriculum. Teachers may use technology to remove barriers such as graphics, web-based presentations, films, videos, rather than a textbook. Adapting curriculum, teachers could use software programs that allow them to make adjustments based on student needs, such as pacing, level of difficulty, amount of practice, and feedback options. All students with intellectual disabilities who are too uncomfortable to fully participate in their IEP meetings perhaps may display strengths, interests, skills, and goals through electronic portfolio presentations. Adapting curriculum plays a significant role in enhancing the life beyond school, such as social contact, access to business and consumer resources, plus recreation and leisure. Teacher wisdom. Intellectual disability fact sheet. Below is a link that will take you to the National Dissemination Center for Children with Disabilities, where you will find Matthew's story. Matt is 15 years old. Because Matt has an intellectual disability, he has been receiving special education services since elementary school. These services have helped him tremendously because they are designed to fit his special learning needs. Last year, he started high school. He, his family, and the school took a good hard look at what he wants to do when secondary school is over. Does he want more education? A job? Does he have the skills he needs to live on his own? Answering these questions have helped Matt and the school plan for his future. Please visit the link so you can continue on with Matthew's story. Below is a list of resources that teachers could use in their classroom. The first resource, the www.jpkf.org, has several links to other resources. I spent quite some time reviewing those, and you can read through the others, but I hope you find them useful. And finally, most of our information came from the following sources. I hope you enjoyed the video.